Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. On the show today, we have Dr. Noor Syed. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Such a pleasure. Please call me Noor.
Oh, okay, will do. I didn't give you a heads up before we started, but something I've been trying to do a little more when I start interviews is I like to start the interview with just a little bit of acknowledgement of that I'm on the stolen lands of First Nation people, in particular the Tla'amin First Nation, and folks who are folks who will be listening to repeat episode, maybe the last sort of 5 or 6 episodes, sort of before this one, will see a common theme now of me doing these land acknowledgements. Earlier episodes, I wasn't doing that. And it's just part of my journey towards truth and reconciliation. On September 30th, today's, just for folks' timeline, today's October 6th, 2022. And so I guess basically a week ago tomorrow, we had... Canada had the second annual National Truth and Reconciliation Day, and that was part of a I think maybe 93 calls to action that came out of this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which essentially was put together to sort of acknowledge and heal. Or try to heal in some way, or reconcile. That's why it's called reconciliation. Get the actual facts about the residential school fiasco of basically. I think it started in like the 1800s and went right into, the mid to late 20th century. And essentially these residential schools were, and again, trigger warning for folks, I'm talking about residential schools, and so if you want to turn the video off or turn the sound off for 3 or 4 minutes and fast forward, go for it. But the residential schools were they weren't schools. They were essentially institutions. They were essentially concentration camps for First Nations children who were ripped from their families, culture taken away, both physically and sort of spiritually. So they made them all shave their heads, and they couldn't wear any of their regalia. They couldn't speak their language. They couldn't practice their ceremonies. They banned the potlatch, which was a common sort of ceremony that Indigenous folks would engage in, and basically tried to make them European Christians. That was sort of the goal of these schools. And through time, they, a lot of atrocities occur in these schools. Folks that are, listening out there that are maybe BCBAs that work in like kind of adult residential care, may be familiar with the concept in that the experiences of First Nations folks in residential schools are somewhat similar to the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities and also immigrants that were put into these institutions back in the day, and lots of abusive practices and those sorts of things. But one of the biggest issues, besides not that all those things aren't horrible things that they've already done, was that thousands of children were lost and killed or died in these schools and were buried on site in unmarked graves, sometimes mass graves, and never to come home. So parents lost their children and they never saw them again. And now we're seeing a lot of sort of, there was I think it made international news when a school, one of the residential schools near where I live, called the Kamloops residential school, underwent something called ground penetrating radar, which they were basically able to see what was underground, and they found what was essentially 215 child graves
Right.
And that number I think is over 10,000 now in North America, and the scans continue, and the uncoverings continue. We have to be careful not to use the word discovery, because First Nations folks have known about this stuff for hundreds of years and knew this was going on and knew this had happened and even talked about it and even told the media about it, but we didn't listen. Anyway, so I'm again, just really grateful to be able to produce this and be able to be on the lands of the Tla'amin, Comox, Homoko, and Clahus people. And I've shared in other episodes that I'm starting to do sort of my kind of work in reconciliation, both which I mentioned to you, Noor, before we started, within our fire department. So I've made some connections with the Tla'amin Fire Department. We're trying to do some kind of cultural safety work there. And then also with my agency, so CBI Consultants, and we've been working with a great organization, which I just want to give a shout out to before we jump into the interview, called Len Pierre Consulting, LenPierre Consulting.com. Len is, he's amazing. And we brought him in last year for our first Truth and Reconciliation Day, and he just blew our minds. And this year we brought in one of his colleagues, a Métis fella named Jordan White, who was equally just awesome and impactful. And we've now got an ongoing contract with Len's company to continue sort of our Truth and Reconciliation growth activities sort of indefinitely. So if you're looking to do any kind of truth and reconciliation work, or I think Canada, or in Canada or the U.S., because the Indigenous communities did not have these lines that we drew on our countries. The whole thing was Turtle Island, or is Turtle Island. I'm sure he could be a really great resource for anyone. So check out Len Pierre. He's brilliant, and he's got a lot of experience working in sort of the social services area. That was kind of where he was sort of before he started doing this kind of DEI consulting work that he does. So yeah, really cool stuff, and really grateful to be continuing on this journey. Really grateful to have this podcast to be able to kind of continue that work in other ways. And I think that's going to be hopefully the subject of some of the conversation we even have today around sort of DEI and kind of how that fits into behavior analysis and some other things. But we'll get to that in a bit. Before we get started, though, I always like to get a little bit of a story from folks on kind of how they got into the field and kind of how they got to where they were. So why don't you give us your journey from discovering ABA for the first time to kind of where you are now?
Thanks, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing that about the land, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, to be here on virtually on this land and doing this podcast. So appreciate you really educating your listeners and all of us on what's happening. So thank you. So nice to be here with all of you, with you, Ben. I appreciate you having me, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit shorter rather than giving you the entire life story. But for those who may not have had the opportunity or honor yet to meet and are listening, a little bit about me is that I am Pakistani and Filipino, cisgender female. I'm Muslim, identify as Muslim, and my parents immigrated to the United States back in the 1970s. So I would be the first sort of born here in terms of my parents' offspring, and that was a really kind of powerful thing for me to grow up, having my hand in different cultures and trying to sort of fit into the United States. And what I really saw was a big part of why my parents came to the United States, I should say, was the opportunities and the resources that were available that they didn't have in Pakistan and the Philippines. So I had a cousin. He just, unfortunately, we just lost him in the last month or so, who was diagnosed with severe to profound mental retardation, when that was a diagnosis in the United States at the time. So when I first met him, his name was Alaraka. He, had some observing responses. He could attend. He laughed. Definitely had needs, but we were able to sort of interact in some way. And so his parents brought my aunt and uncle brought Alaraka here to have treatment. And this was a time when, evidence-based treatment was just sort of growing in its understanding. And I don't know that it had really made its way to
Mm.
the common consumer. And I still don't know in many places. I think in many places it hasn't gotten there. But
Mm.
they didn't have an understanding of evidence-based practices. And they also were not citizens of the United States. English was not their first language. And they were really in a prime position to be
Mm.
taken advantage of. So
Mm.
they found this reputable hospital in the United States that was doing a procedure, an experimental procedure. And they didn't really have an opportunity to ask too many questions. They didn't really understand what was happening, but they thought, okay, this could really help my son. So they entered him into this experimental procedure. And the
Mm.
procedure, so my cousin had seizures, but the procedure was to really do an operation on his brain that
Mm.
ended up, well, yes, it helped his seizures. He lost all sorts of skills and abilities that
Mm.
he had had at the time he entered into the experiment. And after that became a ward of the state in which they were residing, the state in which that experiment took place. And I
Mm.
always thought growing up that if my family had had the understanding of evidence-based practices and understanding the strategies that are available, how different the lives of my cousin and his family might have been. And that's
Mm.
just not something that they had access to where we were from, and they didn't have access here, and they were really, I really think, taken advantage of by these authority figures. So that was the catalyst for me to get into the space of evidence-based practices and understanding how we can do that in a really compassionate and humble way. And then I happened to be fortunate at the time to go to an undergraduate institution, Binghamton University, that Dr. Ray Romanchik was practicing there, who is
Mm.
wonderful. I stumbled on into the Institute for Child Development and Applied Behavior Analysis. From there, was really fortunate to find a great master's and doctoral program with Teachers College, Columbia, under Dr. Douglas Greer,
Mm.
where we did a lot of the application of behavior analysis to schooling. And then I was a direct therapist, I was an administrator, a teacher, a supervisor, home-based clinic, and in
Mm.
school settings. And then going back to my roots, which was really meant the most to me, was that I got a chance to work with organizations like the Global Autism Project, where I was the research and international program coordinator there. And we got to connect with
Mm.
folks from around the world and again, trying to think about evidence-based practice, but thinking again about my cousin in a way that is culturally responsive. And I know that's been a really kind of hot topic and a hot term recently. And I'm glad it is. And I know it will continue to be, because
Mm.
what we can say would be, evidence-based here in the United States or Canada, North American literature is not necessarily so in different parts of the world. So really fortunate to have had multiple exemplar experiences in instruction and with instructors
Mm.
and professors in the field, then globally, consulted with clinics around the world. And now I'm super fortunate, excited to have helped open up an autism clinic at Lehigh University. And I now am a professor at SUNY Empire State College. We launched our ABA program recently. I direct our Center for Autism Advocacy, which I think we'll talk about. And I'm also the director of Anderson Center International, which so humbled and excited to have gone through those experiences and to be here.
Well, first off, I'm really sorry for your loss. Yeah. So, approximately when was this that he came over to and this experimental sort of stuff was happening? Was this like the 70s or 80s, or this?
It was the 90s,
Wow.
which I recognize I'm going to age myself here. The 90s to me feels like 10, 20 years ago, and I recognize that it is not. But I still, I think still recent enough that you'd be a little bit shocked at we sort of when this was happening and what he was asked to do. And I didn't specify it earlier, but what they did was they severed his corpus callosum.
Yep.
Um, and so, I think really clearly now we understand that that's not beneficial. And again, it was experimental at the time, but they didn't give a lot of information to my family
Mm-hmm.
about what this could consist of. And mid it was mid 90s when the experiment occurred. So again,
Mm.
it was some time ago, but not that long ago.
Not that far back. Wow. Wow, what a really unique story you've told about kind of how you got into the field. I always like hearing the origin stories because often they seem like they're going to be the same. You know, someone finds an ad in college and starts working with autistic kids and ends up getting into the field. But every now and then, I get a really unique story, a really kind of inspiring story like yours, of yeah, just that's a traumatic family experience that led you to want to, you know, not have this sort of thing happen again to other people. I worked with a fella, similar kind of story where it's kind of severe epilepsy and um, but quite a few skills, and some vocal abilities as well. Same thing, and I wonder, if it was again, he had the they called it a lobotomy, but I don't think that's what it was because that was sort of something they did, in the
Right.
1800s and sort of thing. But essentially, took out a big chunk of his brain and certainly the seizures ended for the most part. But like similar story, lost all his skills,
Hmm.
lost all his vocal abilities, lost his ability to do most things. And I get why. I mean, severe when there's no other options. And this was a family with privilege.
Hmm.
With access, with two working parents, and the ability to sort of do those things. But I think, evidence based or not, um, sometimes these were the only services that may have been available or at least funded, sort of
Right.
pre 2000. And so I'm not surprised that this kind of happened in the 90s. To your cousin, just knowing that there's been a lot of similar stories, and I think there's a lot of adults in care now that certainly didn't have any of the early intervention and sort of um, things that we're all familiar with now, but also instead of that had some other crazy interventions as we look back at them now. And I don't think folks are always aware of that piece. It's not that they weren't that professionals did nothing with them. It's they did things that were just you know
Right.
hard to grasp.
I think, yeah, that's a really good point, and I don't know how often we still talk about it or teach it, but I used to teach, or I teach in my ethics class about Pillow Angel, um,
Hmm.
which is a case out of the United States. So for those who
Okay.
aren't familiar, this was it was a well-known ethical case. I think that came out of, I want to say, the West Coast of the US, but forgive me for everyone who's listening if I'm incorrect in
Hmm.
that. But Pillow Angel was a young woman, a girl with who was diagnosed with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and her family, and I don't want to minimize their concerns or misrepresent the situation, but to give an overview, and I recommend people look into this if they are interested in it. They were very concerned that they wouldn't be able to take care of their daughter when she got older. So when she began to
Hmm.
menstruate or began to develop, puberty hit, all of those things, that she wouldn't be able to
Hmm.
be taken care of. So they actually petitioned to have her undergo a procedure that would stop her growth. So while she would get older in terms of, her age, biologically her development would be the same as she was when she was quite young. So generally before puberty. And this, as you can imagine, to your point, was a highly controversial topic, a highly controversial topic. And I actually think that the family went through they applied to a hospital for this and went through ethics boards, and it was ultimately approved, and the family was able to have that procedure for their child. So to your point, like, it begs us
Hmm.
to, helps us to really think about what are the ethics surrounding these decisions.
Hmm.
Assent. So not only consent, but assent from the individual. Was she able to give assent for this type of procedure?
Mm-hmm.
If it ultimately helps the family to care for her later on in life, how does that mitigate the decision? I mean, it's really a really complex situation. And I don't know if the family's still posting, but they were on social media as of a couple of years ago, and they were still posting things are going well, and they were glad for their decision. The doctors that were part of the decision went through a lot of a backlash about it. And I think there might have been some ethical conduct investigations. And it continues to be a really kind of controversial part of our history in terms of things like experimental procedures and where it falls,
Mm-hmm.
what's appropriate or inappropriate. So it's something that I, would love for us to think about because it's a very complex situation, but it helps us to at least, I think, get an understanding of the contingencies that surround decision making. And, for all relevant parties in this, what are they thinking and how are these decisions weighed, especially when we consider that the legal decision making ultimately does not lie with the individual that's experiencing these procedures. And also, what
Mm-hmm.
knowledge were the caregivers given? I don't know the answer to that. So it's a tough. Thanks for sharing that story, and it makes me realize it's happening a lot. It's definitely not unique, which is unfortunate. But sometimes people are sort of grasping wherever they can to create a different life for the ones that they love and for themselves.
And I would say it's still happening, like today. I mean,
Yeah.
there's groups like ASAT, the Association for Science and Autism Treatment, that are, constantly kind of trying to sort of debunk, and sort of interventions that aren't evidence based. Everything from drinking bleach to the hyperbaric oxygen chambers, the dolphin therapy, and a bunch of different things in between. But some of these things, I think are just sort of, they're harmless in the sense that, they're not really, I think hanging out and playing with dolphins, besides, the fact that the dolphins are in captivity and it's not really great for the dolphins, isn't probably going to, make anyone's health worse,
Right.
but other things like drinking bleach or going through sort of, there's other spiritual types of treatments, going to the healers. I knew a guy that took 5 trips down to Brazil with his dad to see a healer in the middle of the bush, to cure the autism. I did an interview with Addie Carden in Senegal,
Mm-hmm.
who's a behavior analyst in Senegal. And she talks about how the pathway to autism services for folks there is often, first we go to, and I forget the term, but it basically was a Senegalese term that would be akin to sort of like a witch doctor type person.
Mm-hmm.
They go to this person, get that sort of spiritual healing piece in place, and certainly, it may have some positive effects, on that spiritual level, but the behavioral challenges don't wane or in any way, and then eventually they kind of come in looking for services. So, this has been happening forever, and it's still happening now. But there are some of these treatments out there that are, I think, and this is not exactly the point of our conversation here, but there are treatments out there that are still being used that are very harmful and can have long-term kind of traumatic effects on folks. I think
Mm-hmm.
physical restraints are a common one in today's world. I was just in the process.
Right.
I was just finished reading an incident report from a program somewhere where, an individual was, I think they spit on the floor and they were put into a 20-minute restraint, and that sort of thing. So this kind of stuff's still happening too, and sort of being aware of this stuff, sort of just from a understanding trauma history perspective as well, I think is really important. Like, I would never have thought to ask the questions about sort of, what kind of treatment did so and so get for their epilepsy back in the day? Because that may play a role in sort of, why they don't like going to the hospital, or and other kinds of issues that are kind of coming up. So yeah. Some other things you're talking about. You were involved with the Global Autism Project. That sounds like it was a pretty cool gig. Did you actually go on any of the actual trips and that sort of thing?
I did, yes. I started with our center in Indonesia, which was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and they are doing incredible work out there in Indonesia. So it was an incredibly valuable time, really get to be with the folks who are change makers, and wanting to engage in evidence-based strategies, which is incredible. And to your point, as you were talking, I was thinking about how a lot of the folks around the world. So we concentrate very frequently on our services here. I'm based in the United States, you're based in Canada, and there's certainly a huge need for services here, which is part of the reason, right? Well, we have these things like restraints happening more often because people are their companies are down staffed, people are exhausted. So there is a huge and significant need on the ground right where we are. Then you go into different parts of the world, like Indonesia, where I was, Senegal, like you talked about. I work with folks from all over India, Zambia, Tanzania, and that lack of resources is everywhere, right? So being able to connect with change makers who are trying to implement evidence-based practices and disseminate and share. We got to do this was some time ago, but we got to do parent training. We got to work with them on like how to market the organization, right? How to get funding, what an intact learning it or trial looks like, all of those pieces that go into creating an organization that will sustain over time, and that will be able to engage in these practices. So that was wonderful, and I loved it very, very much, which is why I stuck around for a while and got the opportunity to travel a bit and consult with different centers, and then stayed with them for some time. So while the Global Autism Project is wonderful, and I'm no longer directly affiliated, they're still doing amazing, amazing work. And they had to unfortunately pause their trips during the COVID-19 pandemic, but they are traveling again. So I recommend everyone kind of checking them out because they're a great, great organization.
The Behaviour Speak podcast offers CEUs for the QABA, IBA, and the BACB. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is global. That's awesome. Yeah, I actually had a colleague of mine that did the Indonesia trip. I don't know when you went, but we'll see if there's a chance. Did you meet a fellow named Bernardus?
Yes.
Oh, you did? Yeah,
I
Bernardus.
did, yeah.
Oh my gosh! So, shout out to Bernardus Lariat. That's awesome. Yeah, so Bernardus is from my neck of the woods, and I went to school with him as well.
Small world, yeah. Bernardus is wonderful.
He speaks courses together.
He speaks Bahasa.
Yeah, because I think his family's from sort of somewhere in that area. I think that was sort of the reason why he wanted to go there. I thought maybe.
I don't know. I think when I met Bernardus, he had been there before, but we worked together a little bit, and he is
maybe that's what it was.
He's fantastic.
Yeah, fun, really cool. So, kind of got your story now. So what are you doing now? What's your kind of what's a day for Noor look like?
We just launched, the SUNY Empire State College just launched our master's program in applied behavior analysis in January of this past year. So nice. Super exciting, incredibly busy, really fortunate to say, and a little dumbfounded to say that we're at 60 students already in the program, it's grown quite rapidly. I am super proud of SUNY Empire State College for promoting this kind of instructional model that I'll share, and so thrilled to be able to be part of it, because SUNY Empire really prides itself on affordable coursework and honoring prior learning that others have had. So if you are a resident of New York, the coursework, the cost per credit is $471 USD, which is something that you'll see in some of the state schools. And we're really proud to be able to offer that tuition at a, comparatively, really affordable cost. But what's also super exciting is that if you are a registered behavior technician, SUNY Empire, it's called prior learning assessment, allows for credits towards your bachelor's or your associate's degree. And we have a lot of veterans that come. We really primarily serve what we might consider to be non-traditional learners. So adults, people are going back for their second or third careers. So the majority of our students are folks that have been thinking about applied behavior analysis, but haven't been able to be part of a cohort or curriculum because it's been restrictive in terms of when they have to attend and the cost for attendance. So our classes are online and they're almost fully asynchronous, and all the classes have a strong focus on compassionate humility. It's part of every objective. It's part of everything that we're doing. We're growing,
Cool.
we're learning with our students, with their feedback every single time, always getting better. So shout out to all the students and thanking them. But we're really proud of being able to support a program that focuses on compassion, affirming practices, and essentially is more affordable when compared to other schools in the area, particularly particularly private institutions. So that's super exciting. And
That's really
I also
cool.
direct our center.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, not
Sure.
knowing the U.S. dollars and whatnot.
Sure.
What you said $471 US. What's that sort of comparatively? Like, what would sort of an average price of maybe a course in some other university be?
Yeah, absolutely. So private institutions vary significantly, but for comparison, some of the institutions that I've been affiliated with or been a part of will be anywhere from 700, 800 USD to 1200 USD per credit. So there's a
Wow.
significant sort of difference, in the cost per credit. And I can't take full, SUNY Empire can't take only the full credit, so to speak, for that. It is our public school in New York that offers it. But it's really like such a great thing to be part of a public school institution that is able to offer what we hope is really quality education, but for that cost, which could be a third of other schools.
And just another quick question. So, what makes a university public versus private?
That's a good question. In the United States, so in New York, particularly where I practice, the private schools can be sort of owned by different entities and governed by different, sort of organizations, whereas a public school is a government affiliated organization. So we are affiliated with the New York State government, and our policies, our procedures, all the red tape is essentially what you'd find in a typical kind of New York State government affiliated org. So that can be a little bit challenging, as we'll talk about when we talk about some of the other endeavors and going through all the different policies and procedures. It can be tough because there are so many things when you're working with a government affiliated institution that would hinder you that you don't necessarily have at a private institution. So even things like reimbursable rates and how funding is disseminated, things of that nature, there are really, really strict policies. But on the flip side of that is we get to offer tuition that's generally much more affordable.
Gotcha. So when I hear state university, it's literally the state owns it.
Yeah.
Or runs it. Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, really cool. So you were saying you have a unique instructional model. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the master's program, speaking to that, it is, which is not wholly unique, I think, in ABA, but it is fully online and primarily asynchronous. We only have one or two classes that meet. And what's cool about it is that we are I think the first and so far only public school in New York that has curriculum that also leads to licensure, as well as so New York State licensure, which can be difficult to get, and the BCBA certification. So that's exciting. But on the other side, so I also, what I was mentioning before is I also direct our Center for Autism Advocacy, Research, Education, and Support. And the center, which goes by the acronym CARES, is working on creating an autistic supportive and neurodivergent supportive environment and culture within SUNY Empire. So we're thrilled to be able to do that, because what we're really trying to do is sort of change the way that SUNY Empire and other schools think about inclusivity, really, and sort of embedding support of neurodivergent students within the entire college community.
Really cool. Well, that maybe that's a good segue for you to talk a little bit about this other. I mean, I think we're going to say this other endeavor like 7 or 8 times in this interview, but because you seem to have your hands in a lot of different pools right now. Now, what's the Autistic Supportive College, or is that that thing?
Yeah, so CARES is working on building this autistic supportive college, and what does that really mean? I think it's a great question that I ask myself all the time. So we first tried to figure out is what are autistic supportive programs in the United States? What do they look like? And what we have found more predominantly is that the autistic supportive colleges or universities in the United States are standalone programs. So you'll have, let's say, a mentorship program that someone can enroll in. You'll have a specific sort of sequence of trainings maybe someone could be part of, and a community that someone can be affiliated with, which is wonderful. And we think that that's think that's great for the students that are involved and for all the faculty and staff that gets to be part of it. A challenge with that we discovered, and in our first year, we did a lot of interviewing, a lot of focus groups, interviews, a one-to-one, small group. We did town halls. We essentially, we worked with our students. We did needs assessments. We tried to understand, how can we build an autistic supportive college? What does that mean to you? Or neurodivergent supportive college? What are we looking for? And what we found was that 2 major things. One is that a forced disclosure to be part of a program can be prohibitive and even stigmatizing for some of the students. So for kind of a frame of reference in the US, and I apologize, I wish I could speak to other parts of the world. I know, again, Australia does a lot in this, and I'm not quite sure what other countries, not quite sure what Canada's doing in this space. But in the US, generally only 2% of college students identify with autism, or at least openly identify with autism. Our research suggests that so many more autistic individuals would like to go to college, but are not able to get there because, the coursework is not something that they are able to sort of respond to, or that they are, they grow concerned about different pieces and they're not able to continue. They don't have the supports that they need to continue. And generally, the programs that have existed ask someone to disclose that they are autistic or neurodivergent in some way, and generally register with some type of office to receive support. So that can be really challenging, right? If someone may not want to disclose, it can, again, reports have indicated it can be, they can feel ostracized or stigmatized. And so that's a challenge. The second challenge that's come up quite a bit is that at least in the United States, about 50% of the programs also require additional tuition or an additional pay. So now these students have to pay to get to college, and they have to say, well, they have to disclose and say, I identify with this diagnosis, and now I have to register, and now I have to pay to receive the services. And that
really, wow,
right, yeah. And that
so
pay,
I disclose my identity, which maybe something I don't want to do, and I'm punished because now I have to pay more too.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel, right? So if there were supports for Muslim people, let's say, and I were to go in and say, I'm Muslim, suddenly I'm being charged extra for being Muslim.
Exactly.
Like it doesn't sit well, right? I think there's a big problem in that respect. And so we wanted to address that issue. And then finally, too, some of these programs have a finite number of spots. So if you're not able to get in, or, able to go through the application process soon enough, then you're waiting for supports, which is, I think, a challenge. So what we opted to do, my colleagues and I, in building the center, is that we decided instead, okay, let's try to build a multi-tiered system of support framework within the college environment. So let's implement universal supports throughout the curriculum, the front-facing offices, basically within the entire institution. And let's create more intensive support structures for those who need it. But the first thing we're going to do is try to implement these protocols and these procedures that research supports can help everybody, and put that in place right away so that we can be a resource for students so that they don't have to disclose, they don't have to pay, they don't have to wait. And and we're doing that, just to add to, with a group of advisory team members who are SUNY Empire State College and in the community, that are composed of those who have openly identified with us as autistic, so advocates, autistic alumni, autistic students, current students, caregivers in autism, in the autistic communities, and professionals working side by side, so including behavior analysts, data specialists, and multi-tiered system of support experts, all really working hand in hand to try to build this community within SUNY Empire.
Super cool. Congratulations. That's so awesome. Okay, so a few questions. Sounds really neat. So if you don't have to identify, then I suppose you don't also have to be autistic to go, right? So is sort of the idea of autistic supportive college just sort of something to explain to people, but you don't actually call it that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We have just received an autistic supportive college designation from the Anderson Center for Autism, which, so we will kind of be sharing that at some point more loudly. But that being said, what we've sort of framed our supportive college as, or what we have framed our supportive college as, is really a universal support framework. So to your point, you don't have to be autistic or neurodivergent to access these supports, because things like executive functioning skills is something that I think many of us could benefit from. I know that I can certainly be one of those that benefit from it. So why only hold it for a student that might openly disclose as autistic? Because so many people could really sort of enjoy that use. So while we have that designation, or that designation is coming, it really is in manifestation a change in the way that the college has implemented what they're doing, right? It's trying to streamline all the processes, make it really clear, so that it can be supportive of all students. And then that being said, we're launching a training on autism that's mandatory for all faculty, staff, and professional employees that give a background in autism. And CARES has started to function as a place for being a consultant, really, for students, faculty, and staff when they are thinking about autism and wanting to support each other and support their success as much as possible within the college environment.
Really cool. Okay, so, and I kind of, I want to ask these in the right order, but I kind of, I see why you kind of have to have the autistic supportive college label, at least initially, just to sort of, explain to folks we're trying to be inclusive of everybody, and autistic folk in particular. Well, I think there's a good chunk of autistic folk that want to go to college, whereas maybe folks with sort of some other things going on may or may not. I love the idea of applying the multi-tiered system of support to a college, and it's well timed for my brain right now, because I just finished editing and I'm releasing tomorrow my podcast interview with Dr. Nicole Hollins, and she talked a lot about sort of multi-tiered systems in school settings, and kind of an equity focus and so on. Anyway, so I've had the sort of 3-tier system in my head for the last 24 hours, and so I'm interested to know what do these universal supports look like? Like what sort of things do you have in place that are? I love the idea of universal supports. I'm sorry to keep going for in that they really do in the school setting, sort of like in an elementary school or a high school or a middle school. These are, again, I think I'm sort of reiterating what you just said, but these are interventions or supports or or resources, that are available to everybody in the school. At the same time, they might also be expectations
Hmm.
that apply to everybody in the school, and so often we'll see, things in a school setting. They often talk about the sort of a kind of a matrix of support where they have sort of 3 or 4 kind of general rules, which are like, and they're not rules, they're more like, kind of almost values, like be kind, be respectful, go to class, those sorts of things. I'm sure they're definitely more detailed and more exciting than my examples, but they're things that you would expect from everybody, and then that way all the teachers in the school can sort of be consistent in their
Right.
kind of response to those things, and those are really great. So what are some of those supports then in a college setting? What do they look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we know, and as you probably talked to Dr. Hans about, we know that kind of that multi-tiered system of support framework is based off of the, what has been implemented through positive behavior interventions and supports
Yeah.
and responsiveness to intervention. And so for the folks that maybe didn't listen to that episode yet, but I know Dr. Hans will be amazing, is that it's implementing strategies that we know are generally have been supportive for most learners. So positive reinforcement strategies, right? Behavior specific praise would be considered a universal support. In terms of responsiveness to intervention, which focuses on academics, things like direct instruction can be considered potentially universal support. So evidence-based curriculum, and really kind of teaching towards strategies that we know have been effective in the past. And so this is really interesting. So we try to do that same thing at the institutional level. So universal supports, when it was first described, the term was coined by an architect who was wheelchair bound, and they found that they were thinking, I think, trying to access a building, and they couldn't because they were in a wheelchair. It was only stairs, and they thought, well, there needs to be a ramp for me to get into this building the same way someone who is not in a wheelchair can get into that building. And from that idea, from that sort of sentiment, the idea of universal supports was really formed. And so it's really predicated on accessing the materials and the resources in the college institution in multiple ways, really towards one's strength. In terms of curricular development, and certainly, I want to say that changing the culture of an institution is challenging. So this is a really ongoing project for sure. But we're working on with faculty, let's say, for one example right now, is embedding strength-based learning opportunities within their syllabi. So whereas we might have seen a more traditional, I'll say traditional, but maybe a more historical way of teaching, which was quizzes, tests. At the very end of at the very end of the class, you'll have a final exam, closed book, 2 hours. You have a midterm. Those are the 2 things that you get graded on, which is probably not, as unique. And instead and again, I think a lot of the folks here will be so intimately familiar with these ideas, right? It's as you go along in the course. It's the opportunity to, again, as behavior analysts, right, recycle till criterion is met. So for me, it's not necessarily as important that you learn the material by the time of the exam, but that you actually know it and can respond to it. It's the opportunity of choosing between assignments. So would you rather write a paper, or would you rather create a presentation that's based off of this content? Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? How do you best learn? Because the content will stay the same, just the delivery of it will change. And so it's working with all of the faculty at SUNY Empire State College to gain an understanding of how to do that within their curriculum, and providing support for them and how to build those different pieces. And then so that's just one example, but I'll share too that just another piece of it, which I don't know if I would have categorized this as a universal support initially, but and maybe it's not, but I'll share that this ongoing push towards shaping what is considered equity at a college level and shaping sort of the climate culture surrounding inclusivity has been one of the most, if not the most important part of what CARES is trying to do, alongside of the other offices who are, who are generally supportive of this work. Because I think that we had always framed equity and inclusion in certain manners as related to certain identities. But at least here for SUNY Empire and potentially for some, a few other higher education institutions that I've been a part of,
Hmm.
autism, neurodivergence, disability, that has not been historically considered under the umbrella of inclusivity and equal opportunity. And we know that that's changing. And so it's really
Hmm.
important that we help the college and all the members of the college community see that. And that is an ongoing, initiative that CARES is really trying to push forward.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if I was reading you catching your wording there, but the reason I make that comment is because my next question is similar to sort of a school setting. I think one of the biggest barriers to sort of the MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support in school settings, is the idea of certainly the idea of universal supports makes a lot of sense, and I liked how Nicole kind of added that what she really likes about the universal supports is how creative you can be in creating them as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to be universal, the teachers need to be on board with them. The teachers need to also be, following through with that piece. And so I believe I remember reading a stat back when I was doing my master's, and they were and talking about that there was sort of a rough number of basically getting 80% of the teacher faculty on board is what you need in order to have a PBIS framework work well in your school. I'm curious, what's it been like, and to try to get sort of university faculty on board with this if they haven't been sort of familiar with this sort of model, and do you find that's a similar sort of rule of thumb for where you're at? The second secret word is sustainable.
That is a question. And I would say that it's falling in line with our experience, right, in terms of really shaping that college. And what is the criteria to be considered fully inclusive is a really interesting consideration too. And are we
Mm-hmm.
ever at a place
Mm-hmm.
where we can say, with any equity work, are we ever at a place where we can say that we fully met equity? I don't know. I think that's a really
Mm-hmm.
that's a tough philosophical question.
Mm-hmm.
But it has been it's been a journey, I would say, so far that it's been a somewhat challenging journey, but
Mm-hmm.
a really useful one. I don't think that anybody at the institution would say that they don't want to be inclusive and as supportive as possible. I think everybody
Sure.
absolutely does. The reality is that, at least, and I don't want to speak, I don't want to overgeneralize, but
Mm-hmm.
within the institution where I work, there are a lot of responsibilities and asks of
Mm-hmm.
everybody who works there. Higher education in general has seen much more of a turnover in many areas. I think that the workforce generally has seen some significant changes, during the pandemic, post, during, and now post pandemic.
Sure.
And I think that's definitely affecting us. And so to suddenly say, or to say to folks like we're building an autistic supportive college or neurodivergent supportive college, what I heard a lot was fear, was honestly fear of, what does it consist of, and how
Mm-hmm.
much extra work will this be for me,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
not, giving grace to everybody, not because again they don't care, but because they've been feeling overwhelmed. And the initiative launched in 2020, or
Mm-hmm.
CARES was founded in 2020, and so really we're at the height of the pandemic. So everybody's
Mm-hmm.
stressed and everyone's going through so many things. And
Yeah.
so what we had to do was just sort of take a pause and hear from everybody and say, okay, we're not going to get angry and say, you don't care, you're not believing in equity. Let's instead have more town halls, more discussions to find out what the concern is, what the fears are, and share more about the mission and vision. So when we began to do that, and now we are doing that on an ongoing basis, meeting with folks, we're seeing that people are getting more and more on board, realizing that actually universal supports is not too much of an extra lift, right? If you redo a class once to try to increase strength-based learning, then you don't necessarily have to, then you can start from there if you need to revamp it again, right? And that's not as heavy of a lift as telling you that we have to change everything that you're doing all at once. It's like, here are these tweaks that you can do that will help support a universal design for learning for everybody. And so just bringing everyone along in that way, I think we've seen a movement in embracing this idea of a fully inclusive college atmosphere. It'll take time before we get everybody on board. I don't know if we're going to get everybody, but luckily, more and more of the community is really understanding that these are students that we are serving anyway. These are students that we want to increasingly provide opportunities for them to go to college and to go to university, the same way that we did for other folks who have been historically disenfranchised. So we're seeing people come along. It's a journey, but it's progressing.
Wow, that's really cool. Just thinking about, you kind of touched on the equity piece, and that it's sort of a never-ending, maybe kind of a never-ending journey. Something we kind of talked about before we started, and about an interest of yours, and I think mine as well. And so I think you're starting to do a really cool job here at SUNY around sort of essentially building new systems of support. And there's a term you used, I think, when you were talking about the Global Autism Project sort of efforts around sustainability in systems. I think that's an area that's really lacking in our field, and lacking in, I think, a lot of kind of helper / kind of education fields, but particularly ours. I mean, I don't think we as a field do a great job when it comes to sort of long-term sustainable interventions. I've talked about this. Folks that have listened to a lot of the episodes will know I've shared about this many times, that we have a lot of research that comes out, some really good research, really, fantastic research with some really, neat outcomes. But for the most part, those outcomes are measured for maybe 3, 6, if you're super lucky, a year, after intervention, and then that's it. Then it's done. We don't check it out anymore. And so we don't really know if they're sustainable. And we've definitely seen a lot of really interesting research around resurgence and and all those other sorts of things that sort of lead to challenging behavior returning, and so on and so forth. And it's only been I've interviewed. I think you're interview 49 now, and I've only had 2 people that I've interviewed so far that have done long-term sort of follow-up in their studies to kind of see if skills are maintained and whatnot. And so I don't feel like sustainability is a thing we think much about in our field, and yet families and staff and everyone are putting so much energy and time and resources into trying to make these things successful, especially money. Lots of money people are spending, and we're talking about internationally, where a lot of places don't have funding, and so it's often out of pocket. Talking about these low resource areas. I did an interview with James Lee recently, and he's done a lot of work in kind of low resource countries like Mongolia and Korea and some other areas, and just sort of it's a whole different game. How do we do that? How do we build sustainable systems? It just seems so far, like, out of our reach in some capacities. The sort of idea around systems change. I get sort of small systems change, like you talked about, sort of, some of the sort of quick wins you're doing with some of the teachers and stuff or the professors at the university, but there just seems to be such big systemic problems that particularly in sort of equity and DEI kind of pieces that have just been built and reinforced and built upon even more so that they're never going to be torn down. I don't really know what the question is, but what do we do? How do we get sustainable systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question, Ben. And I think one that so many of us are thinking about, right, and trying to figure out how to make things last over time. I have a few different thoughts. One I'll share is that I think that potentially we might start to reframe what we think of as objectives. So always bearing in mind what's the long-term objective and what are those short objectives that will help us get there, right? Just as behavior analysts, it's very much a shaping procedure. So with the building the inclusive and supportive college, it was interesting kind of thinking about changing curriculum as a short-term gain, which it is towards the longer term, changing the college, but getting to that place where folks are considering changing their curriculum and changing their classes was more difficult than I would have anticipated it to be. Because, if you say to me, hey, this is a great way to teach, let's try it, I think I would be all on board for it. But we have, colleagues that were not necessarily ready to make that huge change. And so when I would come in, right, with these exciting ideas, let's say, of this is where we want to go, and this is what we want to be, and this is our 3 to 5 year plan. And we do have, a dynamic, but a 3 to 5 year plan always. We realize that things take a lot longer than we anticipate that they are going to take. And when I think about systems that we're building, just here as one example, I think about what can we create that will last over time in terms of its longevity. So we are building a website that will house resources that are free to individuals. And while the content will change, that website can maintain over time and be a resource for everybody. Meeting with the deans to talk about how we can support faculty in building these universal supports in their curriculum are things that is a practice that if we can always get on their schedule, we know that now from here moving forward, there's always going to be time dedicated in faculty meetings towards building supports for neurodivergent and autistic students. And these are sort of small gains, if you will, but their cumulative effect is that now the understanding or an acknowledgement or realization of how we can engage in universal support starts being part of the framework. It starts being an expectation for folks. And how we got there is we had to do a lot of we had to get a lot of buy-in. We had to do had to have a lot of conversations, had to understand the systemic issues, had to be able to, we have to be able to speak on what are the benefits in terms of climate and support, and slowly bring people along. So it's really, I'm starting to feel like it's a shaping procedure. And it makes the reinforcement contingencies, I think at times they can feel thinner, but then it's really I have to change my expectations, right? I'm realizing now it's a huge gain to get this meeting on the books every term, every year, because 5 years ago, autistic students were not talked about at all. Neurodivergent students weren't talked about at all. And so that's what I'm starting to feel like it is. And you and I are chatting, beforehand, it's a struggle because there's so many things that I think we, in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, access, it's a phrase that's talked about a lot. And within the camp of behavior analysis, right, you have some who are fully
Mm-hmm.
supportive of it and some who are thinking, where does this land in terms of
Yeah.
behavior analysis? I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I think, what I'm coming down to, how I feel, and I'm very open to thoughts about this, is that there are some things that we need to change immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But although it can be unpalatable and it can feel frustrating, and it is at times, there we might need to really consider how we can work within the systems that we have to change them, right? It does take longer when you're meeting with so many more people and you're revisiting the same certain things, and it feels like it should go faster. But there are consequences and unintended consequences to all of the actions that we're engaging in. And if we take the time to consider how this might impact equity, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we engage in decision A, are we unintentionally alienating any group of people? Are we unintentionally implementing policies that may not actually last over the long term? Have we heard our
Mm-hmm.
constituency about how we need to make a change? And again, I feel like that can be challenging because it means like there's so much more preparation and there's so much more legwork that needs to be done. And if you're outside of that system, you don't necessarily see it. Um,
Mm.
and I want to acknowledge my bias and that I've been in some of these systems. So, I want to really hear everyone's perspective, but I'm starting to feel like you have to keep pushing, keep moving it forward, but do it in a way that
Mm-hmm.
shapes and changes so that things become part of the fabric and the culture of a community.
Mm. Mm.
So asking students if they want to share their pronouns, sharing your pronouns as an instructor, making cultural humility and responsiveness part of every ethical conversation, having an objective for every course that focuses on that. Every
Mm.
conference, there's a line of research that's presented. Those things are small, but they weren't
Mm-hmm.
there some time ago. And if we keep trying to
Yes.
reinforce that, I think we'll get to the long-term goal of increased equity.
Yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I like the idea of sort of the small, what's the seemingly small win, that sort of in another context might be nothing, but when you're going for sort of forever change is what long term. Eventually we want to see, everybody included and everything universally designed, and all those sorts of things, but that quickly gets people's brains messed up and they start thinking, oh, you're just talking about like, creating like a utopia, or you're talking like about a Walden 2 here now, or something that's not never going to happen, in reality. And I think that often gets people to shut down and just kind of give up. But if you're looking at sort of, I love the idea of, I love your point about sort of getting the dean on board to just have that conversation at every meeting for a few minutes, even. That's a huge change.
Right.
Um, um, and you got to be happy with that. I mean, it's quite possible that uh, Dr. Syed's going to be professor emeritus by the time she sees the major difference. You're going to go and look back on 40 years and go, whoa, this has been absolutely incredible. But it took 40 years, and I kept doing that work. But don't get me wrong. You
Yeah.
saw wins every day, and you saw wins every year. I'm not sort of trying to send the message that your job is going to be horrible for the next 40 years and then yay. But it's these slow increments of wins that, like you said, they shape, but they build on each other. Like, I loved your examples in the Autistic Supportive College of, the teachers make this first change of making it strength based, but now it's always strength based. You don't have to keep doing that. It's there, and then build on that. And by the time you're done, you've got this, amazing curriculum that now maybe other universities are interested in, and the one down the road, and then the down the street, and all the state universities, and so on. So I think people want to see in our field. We talked about this before we started. I think you used the
Mhm.
phrase kind of quick, rapid change. They want to see things happen now because if they don't, we're going to fall apart. And And in a lot of ways now, and we talked about this sort of before we pressed record, was that our field is kind of in trouble right now. There's a lot of people that are leaving the field. There's folks that were RBTs that are deciding not to go further. I run a Facebook group for behavior analysts with ADHD, and someone came on anonymously and said, I'm leaving the field. I'm starting a new career today, and they were supported, and that was great, and that was awesome. But we're seeing a lot more of this kind of thing happening. We're essentially, I think the word used, we're imploding, right? Yeah. Like, what do you think's happening? Like, what's going on?
The third secret word is universal.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate very much your take on it. And I have to just, share again that it's like, I'm so interested in how other people are thinking about what's happening in the field, right? Because we only have our lived experiences, our perspective, our instructional history that's been shaped. And I recognize that there are so many things that need to change immediately. But we are, so a few things. I think about, one, the research in behavior analysis and cultural shift and cultural change. And while a lot of the work right now is conceptual, I mean, I think that's where we started very much, right? Like Skinner's verbal behavior. And now look at where we are with verbal behavior development theory. And we think about the way the behaviors of our behaviors interact with the behaviors of someone else, right? We know that behavior doesn't occur in the vacuum. It's very much a dynamic interaction, and everything functions as an antecedent for something else, and so on.
Yes.
And definitely in cultural systems change, we see that these interactions form, an aggregate product. And then when more and more individuals are starting to engage in these behaviors, this culture starts to form, and the reinforcement and punishment contingencies begin to shape what the culture looks like, until eventually we are, really looking at a broader macro system, and then eventually a meta contingency of these behaviors and these values and these traditions that function to maintain our behavior over time. And I look back at, the field, let's say, and when I was starting into the field, we never talked about equity ever. We never talked about humility. It was not part of anything that we have done. And while, again, there's still so much room to grow, I think what we're seeing is we're definitely seeing that these aggregate products, we're definitely seeing a broader meta contingency, which, again, it feels harder because it does need to be, I think, immediate change at times. But you're right, like the reinforcement changes so much, right, when we think about behavior shaping. And it really is that 40 years from now, you and I are having this conversation again, hopefully, and we're looking back and saying, now that this college has made a change, and it's part of a system of 64 other SUNYs, and all the other SUNYs' eyes are on SUNY Empire. They're starting to make the change. So thinking about all of that, I think about your question about the field imploding, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to acknowledge for us here and for everyone that's listening that, today, October 6th, is just a few days after the Association for Behavior Analysis International released draft recommendations to its membership, and a draft report on the contingent electric skin shock, which is a hugely hot button topic in our field. And I'm finding this is really, something that you and I had talked about. I don't want to use the word fascinating because that has almost a positive connotation, but it is definitely giving me pause to look at the way the field is on different sides of this, with all folks kind of wanting to, I believe, thinking the best of everybody, wanting to support what's in the best interest of the client, what's in the best interest of those we serve. And I'm happy to dive into it if we want to. I think to your question about why are we imploding is, I think that the definition, in my opinion, the definition of applied behavior analysis and what the dimensions of applied behavior analysis mean are where we are fundamentally, and that we are trying to better understand it. So ABA, right, we know a core part of the definitions of applied behavior analysis are evidence-based technologies and socially significant behaviors. Um, I I think that we are imploding because we are now, in my opinion, starting to understand what these mean in the context of society today. So to your point about how few research projects have observed behavior change over long periods of time, Dr. Malika Pritchard, so keeping that in mind, Dr. Malika Pritchard also published a paper in 2021 that talked about colonialist research practices in ABA, which generally sort of found that we have not really been engaging in participatory or community-based research practices. So with all of those things that we're thinking about, what are we really defining as evidence-based? Should we as a field begin to shift what we think about as an evidence-based technology? Also thinking about what Slocum and colleagues defined as evidence-based practices, right, with cultural and contextual fit. And what's socially significant, what's acceptable to the client, to those we're serving, and society. Might that shift and change over time? Thinking about, to your point, what was implemented years ago, which we know now is problematic. But at one point the fields had a few hundred people, right? And I know that folks, close colleagues of mine would share that they were training caregivers, brothers, sisters to implement treatment because they couldn't be everywhere at once. And there was literally 200, 300 people in the field, trying to serve everyone that we can serve. So now we're in 2022. We're going to be somewhere else in 20 years, somewhere else in 40 years. Should what we consider as socially significant also change over time? And should we look at what we consider to be evidence-based, considering, again, our historical practices? And often the reinforcement contingencies surrounding research can be, you talked about it, artificial. I would tag that as artificial. Yep. So that's why I feel like we potentially are imploding, which is why we're in different camps on some major issues in terms of what we are accepting as treatment, what we are accepting as science, and how and where do those reconcile. I believe that they do reconcile. I believe in our science. I believe in our field. But I also believe in our field as a compassionate, ever-growing space that we need to really be mindful of.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, we don't have time today. I know we've got about 15 minutes left before we got to wrap up, so we won't dive into the contingent electric shock topic today. Maybe another time, and certainly we can point to folks in some different directions there. But it is interesting to me that, I'm saying we won't dive into it, but here I am diving into it a little bit. It is interesting to me that if we remove contingent electric shock from the conversation, what we're talking about is a practice that's occurring in literally one building in North America, in the world, in fact, I think, because generally speaking, it's not legal anywhere else. Or if it is legal, these places just haven't been formed. And it's just mind-blowing to me that the practices of one building is having such a massive effect on our field, and separating us in so many ways. And it really takes me back to kind of the early days of PBS in the 90s, in the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, when Ted Carr and other folks were talking about, and I think Lavinia and Willis and those guys were talking about sort of removing aversives altogether from the approach. And there was a period where, and some folks listening I might get letters. There was a period there where positive behavior support was in that controversial therapy category, right along with the drinking bleach and the so on and so forth. And it was so interesting that it's a controversial therapy. I think it was a controversial therapy because, I won't get into the reasons why I think it was, but it's an interesting separation again, that it's actually punishment procedures is the line, and yet so many of us, including, if you read I only skimmed that position paper or whatever, the letter, the document that the ABAI put out a few days ago. But essentially, they focus a lot on reinforcement-based practice procedures being important and so on and so forth. They're saying all the right things, and yet somehow it's punishment and aversive procedures that are separating and causing the most damage to our field, which just seems so paradoxical to me. Like, it doesn't make sense to me how this is even happening. That well, we just want to keep a little bit of this, or we can't let go of this. I don't know. It's not a question. It's just.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy making in my mind that this is the central issue in our field in such a time of social movement and social justice and cultural change, and so many cool things that are happening as a result of some really horrible things. The George Floyd murder being, one of those really horrible things, has led to so many good things happening, and yet this thing still hangs, and I don't know.
Yeah, I appreciate that observation a lot, right? Because we think about so many major, as you were talking, I was thinking about so many major issues that are still happening today that we haven't attended to. This is hugely important. There are other issues related and, extensions and maybe even unrelated that we also aren't thinking about as much. For one example, January 1st, 2023 is right around the corner, and the BACB is no longer credentialing folks from the majority of countries in a couple of months. And we talked about how the majority of our research is predicated in North America. And then we talked about what's evidence-based. We know that frequency, things will lose validity when they are in different cultures. We haven't actually assessed for validity in a different culture. And now there are so many folks that are parts working in under-resourced areas that are one solo person in that community trying to raise awareness and trying to help people understand that there are other ways to treat different diagnoses or different identities. And we were talking about that a lot before. We're not talking about that as much now. And maybe we should be. And maybe we should be thinking about how there's, I hope you don't mind me saying here, but potentially the voices of a few have been driving what the field is. And now their voices are increasing, but I would say they need to continue to increase. There's still a significant discrepancy in identities or disclosed identities of folks that are practicing, at a BCBA, BCBA-D level, and RBT, registered behavior technician, to a board certified behavior analyst position. I met with an incredible person the other day who has allowed me to just share a little bit of their story. And they identify as a full-figured person. And they shared that they were removed from cases after one session because reportedly there was a concern that they wouldn't be able to engage with the learners. And I'm being vague specifically, right? They wouldn't be able to engage or work with the learners in a certain way because of who they are. And it is really critical that we continue to pay attention to the inequity that's happening for our clients, but also for our staff, and that we create contingencies where people feel safe in reporting things like discriminatory practices, and that we are doing more of, encouraging higher education, or even, hey, I'm going to say, a wild thing, maybe making it part of accreditation where, practices that will support a more diverse body of practitioners are implemented.
Totally.
And so you're you're really, I think your point is incredibly well taken, that this is critical, right? We do need to absolutely attend to what's happening right now to certain folks and where we are. There are related and other equity issues that we also need to be attending to, because the field is continuing to grow, and we want to promote an increase in equity, diversity, inclusion, and access that we haven't necessarily historically done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have a few minutes left, and you touched on something that is a good segue into sort of maybe my last question. Well, I don't want to shove aside all the problems that our field have. It does seem like a good chunk of the problems in our field are only problems in North America. And what's really interesting, it's really interesting, and we won't get into sort of the reasons why or whether it's good or bad, but that the BACB has sort of pulled out of this, out of accrediting folks. In some ways, I think that's actually been maybe a positive, because it has spurred, I think, a lot of folks in these other countries to even work harder to kind of create systems in their own countries and in their own communities. And by being able to create your own system that's not sort of based on a North American system, which is the BACB, which again, I think there's lots of positives about the BACB, but it's completely separate. I think it opens up some really interesting opportunities, and I'm seeing lots and lots more folks kind of doing work in other countries, and I've interviewed a lot of them, and I've got a lot more of them coming on. And I'm really trying to kind of go around the world in interviews, because it's so interesting hearing the perspective of, like you say, the one behavior analyst in that country. A couple days ago, I interviewed Sharifa Yatim.
Mm-hmm.
She was the first Emirati behavior analyst, and the work she's kind of doing to spread the word. And I've had a few other folks that have kind of been doing that sort of thing, and so it's a really interesting conversation. In fact, we just became the podcast just became certified a continuing education provider for the QABA, which
cool.
is another sort of international credential that's out there. We're also IBAO approved as well, and so there's just some really neat things that are kind of happening around the world. And we talked before that you're actually involved in some work internationally to kind of build systems and develop folks. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you kind of bringing us back to that, and centering that there's so much more around the world, and love that your podcast is featuring these folks. So the center that I'm super excited and humbled to work with, Anderson Center International, has a group right now of 35 incredible scholars that have come to the United States from around the world, who are generally practicing in places where they are one of the only, who trying to form an understanding or has this understanding of autism, and they want to bring back evidence-based practices. So we have colleagues here from India, Zambia, Uganda, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Albania. And they come and they really focus on learning evidence-based practices. As particularly right now, their current internship is in working with individuals with autism and other intellectual and developmental disabilities, and also working on leadership development, how to get the government to buy into making this change, how to raise awareness in the community, how to disseminate crisis prevention training, intervention training, all of those amazing things. And now we're also working on supporting the alumni when they go back home. A lot of our alumni have shared that the training they've really enjoyed it, but then they'll go back and they'll be the only one, and they don't have access to resources. So Anderson Center International, we're so excited to be working on building training databases that are free for folks from around the world, and that people can contribute to and share, disseminate. Hopefully actually trying to get some of those to be peer reviewed as well, which I know is not a common thing for training, but I think would be a really maybe potential step, for us to take in creating this database, and also forming global mentorship program. So by the end of this year, we'll have our first, which I'm really excited about, where we'll have our alumni, folks around the world, experts from North America, experts from different places, who will talk about evidence-based strategies, listen to case studies, give feedback, and really just form a community, a verbal community, where people are working together and exchanging ideas, thoughts, resources, that they know they're not alone. And that's going to be free as well, for our alumni and for the community. Again, our goal is that almost everything that we're doing is free, and even our scholars that come over, they have to invest in that. They pay for their flight here, but everything else is something that we want to provide, because this is a training for them. We don't want this. We want this to be as accessible as possible. So Anderson Center International now has had about 80 alumni over the past few years, and we are growing significantly, and excited to see, you know, our next steps in building that community for folks.
Really cool. So this is something that's all you have folks coming over. Is it every year, or is it?
Yeah, it's rotating because it depends on the political climate and approvals in terms of things like visas. So we
Sure.
have folks that are here that come in on a rotating basis for 12 to 18 months. So our group right now, we unfortunately say goodbye to some amazing scholars sort of almost every month, and then additional scholars will come and join us. So it's this beautiful rotating community where everyone acts as mentors for the other person and helps them to
Right.
really be successful in a different place, and then again supporting when they go back home.
So I know I do have a lot of international listeners as well. Is this something that folks like? What's sort of involved to be a part of this? How
Yeah.
can a scholar be a scholar in this program?
Yeah, absolutely. So to just reach out to me, if you wouldn't mind, Ben, sharing my contact information. And what we do, the process is that you'll fill out an application, you'll send your CV. There are specific parameters per the United States Department of Homeland Security that someone has to meet. It just has to do with education and training, but
Yep.
we believe it's manageable. And so we'll walk you through that process. And then if you feel it's a fit and, it's a good time in your life to do it, then we'll help support all of the paperwork completion, all of the appointments with the embassy, working with sponsors,
Wow.
really kind of from nuts to bolts, we support until you are here with us. And then now we support you on the ground. So it's really, if you feel like this could be a fit in terms of your education, you've had education and your background is in psychology or education, social work, so many different areas that could be related. And you've had some experience or know about working with individuals with autism or other intellectual and developmental disabilities, then it could be a fit. So please reach out, because I'm happy to help support your application and to talk with you more about the program.
Right on. Really cool. Well, I know we're right on the mark here. I know you got an appointment to get to. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I gotta say, super inspiring. I'm definitely less. I'm definitely into glass half full now instead of glass empty around the idea about systems change. I think you've just really, really articulated that well, and how it's possible for all of us to kind of contribute to that. And the work you're doing is amazing. I'd like to have you back. Maybe not 40 years from now, maybe sooner, to follow up and see how things are going. But I'll definitely, I'll be 88 for the 40-year meetup, so we'll see how that goes. And hopefully we can do that with holograms or something. But anyway, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Ben. It was such a pleasure, and I'd love to chat again. Take care,
Awesome.
everybody.